So good morning. It is a joy and a pleasure to be with you. And today we are turning our attention to the confusing phenomenon of untitled artworks. To give you a little bit of a sense of what's coming, I'll be unpacking 4 types of untitled art. And I'll be making the argument that despite, or maybe even because of, untitled artworks being, the titles being uninteresting, generic, oppositional, and opaque, that they do convey meaning. In fact, they work intelligently and in sync with what the artworks are doing. There are going to be interactive polls and there are going to be questions and time for discussion. So please wriggle on up close to your keyboard. I am looking forward to hearing from you. All right, let's dive in. So Marcel Duchamp once said that a title is an invisible color. What he means by this is that although we don't see artwork titles, they permeate every aspect of an artwork. They lead us in our interpretation. And this work by Louise Bourgeois provides a wonderful example. So Louise constructs a towering spider sculpture. It has these long spindly legs that threaten to propel this monstrous creature in any direction. This is a nightmarish construction. But Bourgeois titled this artwork Maman, or Mother. And the invisible color of this title imbues this sculpture with new meaning. It draws connections between a spider and the artist's mother, both of them sewing, spinning, repairing, and nurturing. So in other words, through her title, Bourgeois transforms this otherworldly arachnid into a metaphor for maternal care. So given that we have these wonderful possibilities of titles, why do other artists abandon this and label their artworks untitled? Let's start by establishing when and where this happens. So all of these are artworks held in QAGOMA's collection, and all of them are untitled. QAGOMA holds about 20,000 objects, and it's here that we're going to launch our first poll of the day. How many artworks in QAGOMA's collection do you think are untitled? I'll give you a moment to ponder that question. And while you're thinking about how many of them are untitled, I also want to ask you, how do artworks that are untitled make you feel? I asked this question to my friends, and one of them, Daniel Sherrington, said that untitled artworks are edgy and woke. But how else do they make us feel? What do we think when we see untitled artworks? Please share with me your thoughts in the comments. All right, let's reveal our answers. Lucinda, thank you. So the majority of us have guessed correctly. About 1,000 artworks in QAGOMA's collection are untitled. That's 5% of the collection, or around 1 in every room. That's a really extraordinary number. But untitled artworks can be confusing and annoying. Maybe it's something that we don't even notice. In a 2016 study, Korean researchers found that untitled artworks produce significantly lower levels of understanding and elicit far less attention from audiences. This is pretty upsetting for me because I love art and I love audiences feeling confident and comfortable in front of new artworks. So my goal today in Unpacking Untitled is to impart to you an increased understanding and a heightened attention to these curious artworks which hang in our galleries. Let's start with a brief history lesson. So in Western art, most artworks did not have a title prior to the 18th century. And this explains why some of the world's most famous artworks are known by multiple names. For example, the Mona Lisa, or in English, Lady Lisa, is also referred to by the sitter's last name in Italian. She's known as La Gioconda. In the middle, Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait has also been variously known as the Arnolfini Wedding, the Arnolfini Marriage, portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. And so in this case, this kind of flitting between multiple descriptors reveals that we don't actually know what's happening in this double portrait. It might be a betrothal or a wedding or a portrait of a married couple. There's even a theory that this is a memorial portrait commissioned by a heartbroken husband after his wife passed away. This is a conundrum that is prompted by the fact that this work doesn't have a title, and neither the artist or the sitters are still alive to tell us about this work. During the Enlightenment, the new convention of artwork titles was developed in the context of commercial galleries, public art collections, and the increased mobility of physical objects of art. So with the invention of easel paintings, artworks could move more easily between collectors. Titles became a necessary convention for maintaining track of artworks as they moved around the world and for explaining their subject matter to new and various audiences. But even with the development of this convention, titles aren't as sacred as you might think. And I'm going to use the final artwork on this slide to explain this point. Most of you probably know this artwork by the title Whistler's Mother. But this isn't the title of the work. Whistler actually titled this work Arrangement in Grey and Black, number 1. So to sum up very briefly this little history for us, once upon a time, artworks weren't titled. Then a new convention was developed where they were titled. But where and why did untitled artworks emerge? The first answer lies here in pure abstraction. Pure abstraction describes artworks that do not represent the real world of objects. Instead, they focus purely or wholly on the formal properties of art. So things like line, shape, color, balance, and rhythm. In other words, pure abstraction is paintings about painting and sculptures about sculpture. And this delicate modernist sculpture by the American-Australian Margel Hinder is a perfect example. Take a moment to look at this work and think to yourself, what would you title this artwork? Let's launch our next poll, Lucinda. So would you give it a descriptive, evocative, obscure, or untitled name? And let me just tell you a bit more about this work as you think. So the Art Gallery of New South Wales has been hosting the first major retrospective of Hinder's work, and it's been showcasing what she called space-age sculptures like this one, which cast wonderful shadows on gallery walls. They're often made of wire, they're kind of spindly and light. They don't sit on plinths. Instead, they're attached to the wall or they hang from the ceiling. So in turn, they really draw attention to the space that they are hung in. They make us look up and move around. They call attention to the gallery space and the interplay of light and shadows. We might say that these are works about perception and motion. They make us look and move. So what should we call an artwork like this one? Let's reveal our answers. And our winner here is something obscure, The Lovers. I absolutely love that. A few more of us going for something descriptive, black lines in angular arrangement. And I think if this work wasn't untitled, that's probably the kind of title that Hinder would have gone for. Thanks, Lucinda. So to learn more about why this work is untitled, it's really useful to look at the other artworks and titles being made by Hinder's peers. Here we see her amongst her friends and her husband. All of them exploring pure abstraction. This period in Australia's history produced some of the greatest artists and some of the finest abstraction in the world. I absolutely love Australian modernism. Let's spend a moment just looking at these artworks and thinking about the formal or visual similarities that we see. And again, this is something that you can share with me in the comments. So looking across this period of art, we see a similar kind of interest in geometry. There's a wonderful sense of overlapping and intersecting lines, and there's a very joyful use of colours. There's also similarities in the way that they title their art. So both Hinders, who has another work on this slide, as well as John Pert, title their works Untitled. Grace Crowley labels her work Abstract. Wolfson uses the very dry description of painting number 17. And Margot Lewis attends to the colours in her artwork, labeling hers orange with white. These are all brief, concrete descriptions. So they're not interested in finding some kind of subject matter or even lyrically evoking a feeling. Instead, they all draw our attention to the formal elements in the work, formal elements like abstraction, the medium of painting, or the colors of orange and white. So what's happening here is a double movement away from objects and things in the world towards focusing on form. This is happening both in the artworks and in the titles. Internationally, the same trends were afoot. These are works of post-minimalism, abstraction, and conceptual art by the artists Eva Hess, Agnes Martin, Kazuko Miyamoto, and Ruth Asawa. And if we look at these artworks, we find again this same kind of movement away from lyrical artwork titles. Hess labels hers no title. Miyamoto gives hers the title Untitled 2, and Asawa's is Untitled S.272. There's a sense that maybe this new convention or anti-convention of untitled is still being finessed with that movement between untitled and no titled. These artists are also exploring formal properties, line, shape, and form. They all share a very reduced color palette, and by kind of removing color, they are very much highlighting their materials and the process of making. In these works, we see the same kind of attention as Hinder's to installing works in gallery spaces, thinking about how they attach to walls and hang from ceilings and cast beautiful shadows. There's also a fineness and fragility in these works, and there's movement into more tangled shapes like Eva Hesse's, or biomorphism, those curved and globular shapes of Asawa. So there's a repeated attention to art's formal properties here. And it's here that Untitled emerges as both a convention and a rationale. Artists moving away from representing recognizable objects in order to focus purely on form. And this necessitated the same kind of shift away from language. Stefan Sulzer explains this beautifully when he says that untitled artworks acknowledge the limits of language at our disposal and recognize paintings, and we can put in the word art there, recognize art's essential independence from what can be said about it. Untitled artworks like these are asking us to stop looking for meaning and explanation in the wall texts that hang next to artworks. They want us to trust our senses, to perceive without language, and to focus on what is there. Pure abstraction and untitled artworks emerged in the middle of the 20th century, but these twinned traditions are still very much alive today. All of these much newer artworks by Melinda Harper, Virginia Overton, and Katarina Cross are untitled. Here, there are new formal elements that come to the fore. We might be thinking here of rhythm and arrangement, texture, balance, location, and gesture. So in this context, Untitled is now an established convention. It acknowledges the roots of pure abstraction in art history, and artists use this title to keep directing our attention back to the art. But maybe we can extend this point with newer artists like Virginia Overton. She is a Tennessee-born and New York-based artist. And in her practice, she arranges discarded objects from architecture and farming into abstract installations. They've been described in a whole suite of very beautiful formal terms as precise, economical, rough, silent, unspectacular and battered, as well as dexterous, deceptive, and quietly heroic. When Overton was talking about the unassembled materials in her studio before preparing for an exhibition, she once said, "Oh, it might go in the dumpster, or it might go somewhere." When asked about where her artworks sit in relation to art history, Overton says, "I don't. I like to float around. Obviously, I'm thinking about all of those things like minimalism and post-minimalism, But for the same reason the work is untitled, it makes sense to leave things open-ended. She's been described by Scott Indrasik as displaying a kind of utter lack of pretension that's refreshing as she constructs things solely for the sheer joy of making. He explains that sometimes after exhibiting artworks, she pulls them apart and makes them into something new. So I want to take this example of the way that Overton works with these objects that she pulls apart and puts back together, that maybe for her, artwork titles are too fixed, too prescriptive. Maybe for her, artworks that are untitled feel unfixed, allowing us a kind of freedom in the way that we interpret them, but also a sense of being unfinished so that she can pull them apart and chuck them in the dumpster or maybe turn them into another work of art. Let's pause there for a moment for me to have a look at some of the things that you have been saying and to answer some of your questions. From Stephen, we have the question, who has the right to title a work? And so I suppose, Stephen, you're thinking about those earlier artworks from when art was not normally titled. That role normally belongs with galleries, and they normally go with something very straightforward and descriptive. And Leek replies, the entitled, which I guess galleries are. And Cal says, I'd love to create an artwork where the art is actually a book, where the viewers are invited to write their own title. Sounds wonderful, Cal. Let's move on. A silhouetted cowboy gallops across a desert landscape. Huge white clouds fill the blue sky behind him, and in one hand he spins a lasso, hinting at a drama waiting to happen beyond the camera's lens. Richard Prince is an American artist famous for appropriation. In this work, Untitled Cowboy, he photographs an advertisement from Time magazine. And I'm going to ask you, what do you think this advertisement was advertising? If you know, maybe stay quiet for a moment, but if you don't know, you can share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think this photograph is advertising? So in this work, Prince didn't stage the scene and he didn't take the first photograph. Instead, he's declaring the acts of re-photographing and retitling as valid forms of creativity. This is quite a daring postmodern strategy where he's questioning the value that art places on originality. It's also an extension of ideas that were first posed by modernist artworks like Duchamp's ready-mades or Mary Kelly's soiled diapers, which propose that art doesn't need to be concerned with the physical acts of making. Instead, art might occur in the conceptual acts of selecting, signing, and titling an object as art. For Prince, this gesture certainly paid off. In 2005, it set the record for contemporary photography, reaching $1.2 million at auction. So what was being advertised in this original photograph? Certainly a good number of you have guessed cigarettes and jeans and the Marlboro Man. So the answer is Marlboro cigarettes. The Marlborough Man, or the Marlborough Cowboy, who we see pictured here, was a hugely successful advertising campaign. It was developed at the time that filtered cigarettes were introduced. Filters were thought of as feminine. So this advertising campaign was filled with hyper macho imagery in order to counter that perception. For Prince, this photograph is interesting for the way that it reproduces archetypes of a quintessentially American and Wild West masculinity. So the figure here is young, erect, and strong. He's in control of his animal and at one with the land. There's ideas here of ruggedness, capability, and individualism, as well as a moral code that operates beyond the law. Within 2 years of this advertising strategy, Marlborough had quadrupled their sales and moved to the leading position in the cigarette industry. At the same time, 5 Marlborough men died from smoking-related causes. So Prince's reproduction of this photograph is very heavy with this history. By relocating this advertisement in a gallery, he's asking us to pause and to reflect on the ways that imagery is very powerful in the contemporary world and how it controls our behavior. In other words, this artwork is doing a very different thing to the pure abstraction that we've just been looking at. It's not asking us to focus wholly on interpreting the image. In fact, the meaning of this artwork very much lies outside the frame with that cultural history. So if this work is doing something very, very different, what role does Untitled play here? Prince belongs to the Pictures generation. This was a group of American artists that rose to fame in the late 1970s. It includes artists like those pictured here, Jack Goldstein, Cindy Sherman, and Sherry Levine, as well as some other names you might know, Barbara Kruger and Louise Lawler. All of these artists were interested in the construction, circulation, and consumption of mass media, especially film, photography, and advertising. And many of these artists were using this existing imagery to develop a very cool and detached critique of visual culture. For example, if we look at Goldstein and Levine, both of them are glitching their source imagery. Goldstein's lion, taken from Hollywood, is roaring on repeat, while Levine sketches out a man's silhouette with a photograph of a wistful mother. Both of these artworks are interested in revealing the naturalism of the scene, making us aware of these images as constructions. So untitled artworks by this generation repeat their disavowal of originality and authorship. Said another way, their untitled titles signal that this art is intentionally uncreative. It's concerned with repetition and copy. In their works, they use pre-existing imagery as well as a pre-existing convention of the non-descriptive, untitled artwork in order to slip into the stream of circulating imagery. And I want to just use Sherman to further highlight this point. So in her photograph, a woman is pictured trapped in a domestic space and looking beyond the camera. Her disheveled hair and bruised face suggest that this moment records the aftermath of a dramatic and violent event. But the details of this event are unclear. This work is from her larger series of film stills. In each of these, the artist casts herself in the role of a film starlet, and she shifts from sultry neighbor into dour housewife, slick modern woman, and naive country girl. Taken in total, this series maps out the limited roles that are afforded to women on the silver screen and beyond. So in this context, Untitled for Sherman is describing the film image as generic, but even more powerfully is describing that unknown woman in the center of the image as ubiquitous and exchangeable. Postmodern artists all rejected newness in favor of visual recycling. They returned to established imagery in order to think about the patterns and possibilities and problems of representation. The pictures generation focused their sights on mass media, but this larger group of artists turned their attention to works from art history. If you spend a moment with these artworks, you might recognize the source material and be able to think about the way that these newer artworks have been changed. If we kind of conjure into our imagination the works that these are repeating, in the contemporary versions, there are parts that have been erased, parts that have been exaggerated, and parts that have been collaged. And if I draw your attention to the bottom of the screen where we see all of the titles, we'll see that there is a new naming convention here. In every instance, untitled is followed by the word after, and then the name of the artist or the artwork that is being referenced. So in other words, the kind of space in the brackets after already offer a complete, full and legitimate title. You know, for example, if we look at the first one, After Courbet, L'Origine du Monde, surely that could function as a title by itself. Why is the artist also using the word untitled? Well, I want to use these examples to say that these artists are using Untitled hand in hand with their artworks. Their imagery is recycling images known from art history. And so too, their titles are now recycling a firmly established convention. Untitled here functions as a shorthand that says to us, I'm not original and I don't value originality. Instead, I'm interested in the way that my art belongs in conversation with other practices. And I want to draw your attention to the ideas, problems, and values raised in the past. Okay, and again, I'll just take a moment to stop and see what you've been sharing with me. So from Neil, about the Marlborough Man, he's thinking of After Walker Evans by Sherry Levine, which is very much the same concept. So Sherry Levine is part of the same pictures generation, whose fame particularly for her photographs where she re-photographs existing photos. That's a bit of a tongue twister to say. Re-photographing existing photos. Sherry Levine also introduces a gendered element in her artwork. She is a woman and she focuses almost exclusively on photographs previously taken by men. And Cal asks about the intellectual property at play here. And Prince has been taken to court over his artworks. He has especially been taken to court over images that he has appropriated from Instagram. The courts have upheld his practice, so he is a very wealthy man. Oh, and here's just a lovely bigger close-up of what's happening in Robert Longo's copy of Helen Frankenthaler. So there's a kind of beautiful juxtaposition between the freeness of the Frankenthaler and the very tight mimicry of the Robert Longo in charcoal. So discussion of untitled artworks would normally stop there, but I want to just use the end of this talk to outline two further areas where untitled reiterates an interest. And I'm going to do this by thinking about how art intersects with language, especially how art operates in relation to semiotics and post-structuralism. Let's start with these three contemporary works of art. We see a photograph of two women, the interior of a house cast in concrete, and a very creepy dancing robot who is looking at you via the mirror. All of these works arouse a cornucopia of opposites. So immediately ones that come to mind are things like black and white, inside and outside, human and robot. And we're going to launch our third poll for today. If you look at these artworks, what other opposites can you see? And as you think about that, let me tell you a little bit more about these three works. So Shady Guardirian is a Tehran-based photographer, and her portraits stage anachronistic visions of contemporary Iranian women. In this series, which is named after the Kahar dynasty of the 1700s to the early 1900s, she's pairing antique clothing with hyper-contemporary objects that are either banned or restricted in Iran. Beneath her, we have Rachel White-Reid, who is an English artist associated with the Young British Artists, or the YBAs. Her sculptures transform the interiors of domestic objects and architectural spaces into solid forms. She made this work from the interior of a condemned house in a poor area in London. It lasted 80 days, which was just 10 days short of its planned 90 days, before mounting criticism of government expenditure on art prompted it to be demolished early. And then we have Jordan Wolfson, who is an American artist whose recent rise to fame as an enfant terrible hinges on the use of violent and creepy humanoid animatronics. This work, Female Figure, is a robot form that dances in front of a mirror. If you look closely, you can see that she's actually attached to that mirror with a metal pole. She speaks with Wolfson's masculine voice, and she uses face recognition software to track you as you move around the gallery and make very disturbing eye contact with you. All right, let's reveal our answers. How did we go? Most of us got some got a few. Oh, congratulations to who was on a roll. And we have some that say, no, help me. I will help you. All of these artists draw on the evocative tensions of opposites. So Guardirian draws on past and present, rules and rebellion, public and private, east and west. White-Reed might make us think of present, absent, inside, outside, as well as rich and poor. While Wolfson's object makes us think of human and non-human, seeing and unseeing, enticing and revolting. This attention to opposites is grounded in structuralism. This is a theory that nothing in our world is inherently meaningful. Elements only gain meaning in relation or in opposition to something else. So, in other words, this is an idea of the way being structured via opposites. And I want to use this tendency to think about how untitled might be an opposite. I've just lost my screen. We're on the Farin. I can see on another computer. So I want to use Anne Ferran to make this point. Farin is an Australian photographer, and she often works in series. All of these are photographs from larger explorations that provide a sense of her practice. It's rich with themes of nostalgia and touch, emptiness, narrative, youth, and femininity. Farin makes haunting images. She's inspired by overlooked stories, absences in the archive, and the anonymous lives of institutionalized women and children. She explains that she's attracted to places and objects where there's some kind of gap or absence or disconnection. And the largest work, Untitled Christening Robe, is from her series Flock. Here, Farin is using historical garments to create photograms. These are reverse photographic images made by placing objects directly onto photosensitive paper. And the resultant black and white images are curiously both forensic and delicate. They call forth the binaries of presence and absence, here and there, living and dead, remembered and forgotten, known and unknown. Writing about this series, Robert Garrett explained that Farin doesn't use her art practice to uncover the story of the garment's owner or its maker. She's not promising to bring unknown things to light through her photography. Instead, Garrett suggests she's imbuing the dress with an aesthetic weightlessness that highlights their unknowability, their untethering from context. It's a strategy that she uses to acknowledge the very real gaps that are in our archives and our histories. and the inability for a photographer and photography to somehow conjure this knowledge into being. This is a really interesting strategy. Normally, we think about art in terms of what it can do, how it brings things into the world and makes us feel. But Ferran is flipping this approach. She's using photography to sketch out the limits of the medium, to acknowledge what it can't do. And so in this context, Untitled is a form of negation. Untitled artworks deny, contradict, undo, and oppose. In this work, Untitled reiterates the anti-memorial nature and impossibilities of her practice. And again, I'll just take a moment to look at some of your comments. Thank you. Yes, definitely. From Jessica, we have, do we see a connection between untitled and unauthored? Thinking about Gerhard Richter. Yes, definitely, 100%. And the only reason I didn't use Gerhard Richter is because I've already spoken about him in other talks. But Gerhard also very much belongs to a generation that is interested in how art intersects with photography and the circulation of images. Okay, let's move on to our final example. There we go. So across this beige canvas, teamed with semi-square shapes of blue, green, and orange, Elizabeth scrawls in a very unpretentious hand the word "Ceci n'est pas." This unfinished phrase translates to "this is not." What do you think here Newman is trying to say? And we'll launch our final poll for the day. While that's happening, I'll tell you a little bit more about this work. So the Griffith University Art Museum, just down the road here from QAGOMA, recently mounted a solo exhibition of Newman's practice. The curator, Naomi Evans, borrowed words from another one of Newman's artworks to give the exhibition the very curious title, "Is That a No?" In Evans' words, this survey of 30 years of Newman's practice showcased the negations, disavowals, and excisions in Newman's oeuvre. So there's the same kind of interest in negation as we've seen in Farin's work. In Newman's art practice, this interest manifests in visual forms. Think about the blank spaces in this canvas. But also, and for the first time in this talk, she's expressing an interest in negation through the written word. This is not. Let's have a look at our answers. What do we think she's trying to say? This isn't finished is coming out as the winner with a very strong follow-up with "this isn't a pipe" and "this isn't titled." And if you're confused, that's fine. Let's try and unpack it now. I'm just gonna, there we go. So Newman is borrowing her phrase from one of the earliest and curliest uses of text in art. The surrealist Renee Magritte paired his painting of a smoking pipe with the cursive text "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," or "This is not a pipe," and titled his artwork "The Treachery of Images." Naomi Evans explains that Magritte is drawing here on the ideas of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure to exploit his concept of the arbitrariness of the relationship of words to things. So in other words, the idea that meaning is not inherent and it's completely arbitrary what we name different objects. She describes Magritte's artwork as a freeing of images from words. And the sense of freedom in Untitled has run as a thread throughout this talk. Untitled has been used as a kind of unshackling from the written word. But I believe that something else is happening here, maybe even the opposite. Words have been appearing in art for over a century now. They began in Cubism with Georges Braque's use of collaged bus tickets. It then skipped through the dictionary definitions of Joseph Kossuth and the confessional diary entries of Sophie Caille. Art in the 21st century is awash with the written word. And I want to argue that in contemporary art, in works like this one, images are intricately bound with and to their words. They acknowledge this relationship. And we can understand this point maybe a little further if we also look at this work by Richard Bell. With his use of language, he seems to speak to us directly. And when we read, we hope and expect to understand his meaning simply and directly. But his text is just as confronting and cryptic as an abstract artwork. So in this context, in Newman's work and Bell's work, Untitled artworks are acknowledging that words are part of the visual field, and they are using them in a post-structuralist manner to say that words are just as open and confusing and indeterminate as visual forms. Rather than attempting to escape language, Newman and Bell both use the written word to repeat the slipperiness of their art. It's a maybe slightly peculiar way to think about language, but I hope that this morning I've given you a little bit more of an understanding of untitled artworks. I hope that next time you see an untitled work in a gallery, you might stop to think about how it reiterates what's happening in the artwork. Is it asking that you turn your attention back to the frame? Is it telling you that it's a repetition of a new convention? Or is it saying that art and language work hand in hand and both are equally confusing?